Welcome back, everyone. Nice to see you all again. As Daniel Rosenberg would say, we're going to begin. My name is Julie Sweet-Kind-Singer. I'm the Senior Associate University Librarian for Collections and Public Services here at Stanford, and I want to thank you all for coming and supporting us here at the David Rumsey Map Center. It's really wonderful to see us all back after the last meeting we had, which was virtual. So it's great to be together, and thank you all for participating so fully. So I'm very happy to be the host of this next session, the head of this, the person introducing these two folks, because Daniel and Garrett are two people that I know and have known for quite a while. And so I'm really delighted to be able to introduce them to you if you don't know them. And if you do know them, you already know what luck we have in having them both with us here today. So Daniel's going to start us off. Daniel's a professor of history at the University of Oregon. He's an intellectual and cultural historian for modern Europe with a focus on the history of information and information graphics. His books are Histories of the Future and Cartographies of Time, a history of the timeline. And if you are interested in the timelines, that book is really spectacular. He's published in a range of different venues, including the Journal of the History Ideas, ISIS Media History, and 18th-Century Studies. He has a recent publication in the Brick Pencil and Making Things International, and he's also a co-editor at large and contributor at Cabinet Magazine. And he spent a year with us here at Stanford as one of our humanities fellows, which is when I got to know him, which was really wonderful. Garrett Dash Nelson is a historical geographer who serves as a president and head curator at the Leventhal Map Center and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And I had the great joy of being on their advisory panel for a number of years and actually working on the search committee that brought Garrett to the Boston Public Library. So it's been really wonderful to see him there and see him flourish. His research interests combine the urban and regional landscape history of North America, the relationship between geographic knowledge and politics, and the digital geohumanities. And he's published works in both scholarly journals, such as the Journal of Historical Geography, PLOS One, and Progress in Human Geography, as well as public venues such as Places Journal and the Boston Globe. So please join me in welcoming our next two speakers, and we'll start with Daniel.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. A bit of a strange setup with this thing. I will try to be visible and audible at the same time. I'm Dan Rosenberg, and I like straight lines. Sorry, RJ. Thank you to the library for having me here. It's a great pleasure. Thank you to Stanford for having me back. As Julie said, I was here a number of years ago as a fellow at the Humanities Center, which was a really amazing experience. It's great to see David again. Great to welcome Evan. I also want to I also want to acknowledge before I start a couple of my very important collaborators at the University of Oregon Infographics Lab, Joanna Merson and Eric Steiner, who may be known to some of you since he used to be down here at SESTA at Stanford. Collaboratively, we have been building an online interactive version of the two great Joseph Priestley timelines that I'll be talking about today. I'm not going to talk about the online project. I don't have nearly enough time to do that. But I do want to say, as a way of beginning, that the reason why I am so deep in Priestley right now, and the reason why I know so much more about Priestley now than I did when Tony Rafton and I did Cartographies of Time, is because of this work that Eric, Joanna, and I have been doing together. So I just want to make sure to acknowledge them at the beginning. So I have a lot to say in very little time. I think I'm going to hit my mark. I hope I'll hit my mark. but I have a couple of millennia to cover. Not a joke. The image you're looking at is Joseph Priestley's 1765 chart of biography, and I suspect that most of you are at least a little bit familiar with it. It's one of the most important diagrams in the history of infographics in general, and a crucial waypoint in the history of chronographics specifically. Before Priestley, almost no one used a straight measured line to represent historical time. After Priestley, it became so common as to be unremarkable. I expect that from where you sit, the words on Priestley's chart are much too small to read, so let me just clarify what's going on to give you a foothold. As its title suggests, this is a chart of names. Priestley has chosen about 2,500 important names from 3,000 years of history, 1200 BC to 1800 AD. Along the top and bottom of the chart are the main lines of historical time measured out at intervals of 100 years. The chart's horizontal rows are there to sort out different kinds of biographical achievement. There's a row for scientists, a row for artists, a row for politicians and generals, and so forth. And in the chart, all of those little horizontal lines you see, those are the lifelines. Each one is tagged with a name. Where there's uncertainty, Priestley uses dots instead of or in addition to a solid line to show you whether he has the exact dates of birth and death or not. In this example, made to demonstrate how the chart works, you can see at a glance who died young and who lived a long life, who came earlier and later, and whose lives overlapped. You can see patterns too, rhythms of development and succession. Compare this to the complexity of expressing these same relationships and patterns in words, and you can understand why Priestley's contemporaries were so taken by his example. I was going to read that, but trust me, there are a lot of words to show you something that's very simple at a glance. There was no technological barrier to making a chart such as Priestley's earlier in history. The graphic tools necessary to make such a chart were already common centuries earlier among cartographers and astronomers, for example. Here's an opening from the first printed edition of Euclid's Elements, published by Erhard Rathold in Augsburg in 1482. As you can see, even in the very first decades of print, the technical capabilities necessary for making a Priestley-style chart were fully available. In fact, the very next year, Rathold published a print edition of the Chronicon by the 4th century Roman scholar Eusebius, his great chronology, which would, until Priestley's time, remain the key European model for chronographics. What this means is that prior to 1765, visualizing historical time as a straight measured line simply was not of much use. Conversely, it means that since Priestley, the importance of this manner of visualizing historical time has never waned. This is not to suggest that the Priestleyan timeline has had no competitors. This stream of time, for example, is a chart first published in Germany and Austria at the start of the 19th century and thereafter all over Europe. It offers a kind of romantic rebuke to Priestley's attempt to figure historical time as a graph, replacing Priestley's sterile and uniform grid with bulgy organic river forms. And yet there along the side of the river of time is a linear measure. Admittedly, it's not the main visual argument of that chart, but there it is, playing the role that it continues to play as both a metric reference and as a kind of semiotic key telling us that what we are looking at is time. A few words about Priestley. He was a prolific scientist and writer, a member of the Royal Society, a close friend of Franklin, Price, and others, discoverer of oxygen and inventor of artificial carbonation, political and religious radical. After his home and laboratory were destroyed during the Church and King riots of 1791, Priestley fled to the United States, where he lived his final decade as a political refugee. In fact, his politics turned out to be too radical for the young republic, and he was threatened with deportation under the new Alien and Sedition Acts in 1797. Through all of this, Priestley remained a determined believer in progress. Personal and legal persecution did not shake his faith. In any case, he thought that particular events were less important than aggregate patterns in a larger shape of history. This is what he sought to illuminate in his charts. The biographical lines on this chart, Priestley said, were like so many tiny straws swimming on the surface of an immense river of time. To perceive how new Priestley's charts were in their day, we have only to observe that the common line graph was not invented until 20 years later, in 1786, that its inventor, the Scottish economist William Playfair, referred to Joseph Priestley's chart of biography as a key precedent, and that Playfair in his first experiments with the line graph regularly included Priestley-style chronographics, as in the timelines of the kings of England and France, which you see at the top of this diagram. 18th century Europe was, of course, exploding with new technologies of time, utterly reorganizing not only scientific knowledge, but as E.P. Thompson famously argued, everyday lived experience. In 1761, John Harrison won the famous English longitude competition with his H4 marine chronometer, capable of maintaining synchronized time through the trials of transatlantic voyage. In 1785, James Watt, an associate of both Priestley and Playfair, attached an indicator device to his steam engine to record changing pressure in the boiler. During the French Revolution, regularizers promoted a decimal system of timekeeping. Priestley thought that if you organized history by category and laid it out against a measure, you would see quantitative patterns invisible from the perspective of individual lives. You would see periods and you would see movements. The classical period would show on the chart as a cluster in the region of philosophy. The Middle Ages would show as a sparsely populated region in science. Though we tend to think of timelines as offering us events in series, Priestley's charts were in fact especially powerful mechanisms for displaying synchronism. When you think about real time, you are thinking along the vertical axis of Priestley's space. Priestley knew he had to put names on his chart since he had no rollovers and no hot links, but he encouraged his readers to see his chart primarily as a graphic artifact rather than a linguistic one. In his instructions, he writes, quote, "It is the black lines which are to be attended to. The names were only added because there was no other way of indicating what the lines signified." Given the choice, Priestley probably would have been quite happy with a rollover, but throughout the design of the work, we find telling visual decisions enforced by the rigors of paper, decisions about which we have more flexibility today and also more opportunities for laziness and indecision. Priestley's format proved highly adaptable and it quickly appeared in many different applications. It worked for linear historical time. It could also be used to track cyclical phenomena such as harvest seasons. Thomas Jefferson used it to track the availability of vegetables in the Washington, D.C. green market. Within a decade or two, the format had become so much a part of the common visual grammar that it ceased to be regularly attributed to Priestley at all. For Priestley, chronography was about visualizing pattern, and he thought that in his chart of biography, he had revealed at least two major patterns of importance. First, look at the right-hand side of the chart. Priestley argued that progress was real. He said that when we visualize history in aggregate, we can actually see this. Prior to the 17th century, progress had always been vulnerable to reversal. But during the 17th and 18th centuries, a tipping point had been reached, after which the sheer density of innovation had become self-sustaining and borderless. Second, look at the bottom row of the chart, the row of statesmen and warriors. According to Priestley, there is no historical pattern here, except if you consider endless, repeated, and undifferentiated acts of violence to be a historical pattern. The world, Priestley wrote, hath never wanted competitors for empire and power, and least of all in those periods in which the sciences and the arts have been most neglected. Priestley was, of course, not the first scholar to construct a visual tool for displaying historical chronology. We can find many precedents, and of course, any year-by-year list of names or events already in some way suggests a metrical approach, as does the grid of the Eusebian table, which you're looking at. But until the 18th century, even the table format did not typically hew to a regular measure. In this image from a 9th century manuscript of Eusebius's Chronicon, you've previously seen it in print, you see on the one hand the remarkable formal discipline applied to the space of inscription, and on the other the difference in relation to the Priestley as regards temporal measurement. Here, the distance between years, which in this opening ranges between 1 and 4 lines of text, is determined by the amount of text to be given in any particular year. It's important to say that this was not in any way a deficiency of Eusebius's design, it's simply a reflection of his interests. The aim of his charts was to put events in order and to synchronize them properly across traditions. Both things could be achieved without applying a standardized visual measure, and its format saved space the same way that the wrap function saves space in your Excel. Yet the very fact that in Priestley's day, tabular chronology had been in use for more than a millennium, and yet was not typically laid out according to a metrically regular format, is powerful evidence that Priestley's chart represented an epistemological sea change. Priestley himself felt his approach to be surprising enough to merit a book's worth of explanation. To be clear, my interest here is not in claiming that Priestley is the most brilliant or that he is a sole inventor in this area. And indeed, any such approach would be antithetical to Priestley's own view about how innovation takes place. In this process, there were many hands involved and over many years. In his 1609 Chronological and Historical Theater, the German chronologist Christoph Hellwig regularized Eusebius's chronological layout. And from the late 17th century, a number of scholars began to experiment with more complex and compressed visual formats. In 1685, the English dissenting minister Francis Tallents published this View of Universal History, which, while still using something like the Eusebian approach, burst the grid with genealogies and other graphic interventions while compressing a millennium's worth of information onto each page opening. Early 18th century engravers experimented widely. About 1720, the German printer Christoph Weigel transformed the Eusebian grid into a volvel, in which dates were inscribed around the outer edge of the circle, and kingdoms were represented by concentric circles. A movable pointer aligned synchronisms among these circular bands. In a remarkable Back to the Future moment in 1753, the French botanist Jacques Barbeau-Dubourg laid out a Eusebian-type table on a scroll, the very format rejected by Eusebius in favor of the Codex. Barbeau-Dubourg mounted his 33-foot-long chronology chart in a purpose-built crank box. Diderot referred to this as a machine chronologique. Among these devices, the most intriguing to Priestley was a chart published in Paris in 1750 by the historian and cartographer Jean-Louis Barbeau de la Bruyère, which combined the virtues of many of the preceding artifacts. Barbeau had worked with both the cartographer Guillaume de Lille and the chronologist Nicolas Lenglet Dufresnoy, and his chart clearly expresses this double filiation. On the one hand, it is obviously an interpretation of the Eusebian format, which Lenglet Dufresnoy had himself employed. On it, we find rows for years and columns for themes. But Barbeau also does something very different from Eusebius and his continuers. Rather than devoting columns to kingdoms, in Barbeau's chart, columns represent geographic places. Though the shift may seem subtle, its graphic implications are large. In a Eusebian table, when a kingdom expands or contracts, this is represented by text in the column for that kingdom. In Barbeau's chart, when a kingdom expands or contracts, this is represented by the unification or division of the graphic space of adjacent columns. Now the table has become a diagram. Priestley had a lot of quibbles with Barbeau's chart, and in his own adaptation of it entitled A New Chart of History, he did things differently. Among other things, he switched the X and Y axes, and he cut down on the visual chatter, but above all, he regularized the temporal scale. In Barbot's chart, early years were compressed compared to modern ones, something like the poles on a Mercator projection. Making a visual comparison across eras difficult, Priestley would correct this in his version. Though Priestley's new chart of history did not appear until 1769, 4 years after the chart of biography, we know he was already thinking about it in 1765 because he discusses it explicitly. It's also clear from his discussion that he thinks of this chart, the chart of biography, as a partial step toward the more fully linear visual language that the chart of biography would announce. For everything that was successful in Barbot's model, in Priestley's view, it was still bound up with both the old tabular system of Eusebius and a kind of geographic vision which was extraneous to the problem of chronology. Priestley sought a more radical graphic simplification, the endpoint of which would be a kind of map without territories where everything was represented by a line. It was not that Priestley did not appreciate the value of geographical representation that Barbot had achieved. In his new chart of history, Priestley would largely follow that model, after all. But for more purely chronological reference, such as the lives represented in the chart of biography, Priestley aimed to cut down the chart to its barest bones. Once Priestley published the chart of biography, its example caught on quickly. The chart and the book sold well, going through many editions. It was praised in the press and very widely imitated. And within a couple of decades, the approach was essentially no longer associated with Priestley anymore. And this is, of course, a situation that persists, though today, unlike in the 18th century, no one needs an instruction manual to operate the chart of biography. The timeline is part of our native visual grammar, and it really is everywhere. So I have 3 more images to show if I'm okay. Am I? Yeah, okay. So let me just show 3 more images to bring us quickly up to the present. This first image is a screen capture from Final Cut, one of the Apple video editing programs, and I assure you, Apple is not alone in employing this Priestleyan visual approach. Moreover, it's not limited to video editing. I show this to you in part to reinforce how unchanged Priestley's visual format remains, and partly to emphasize that Priestley's timeline functioned as an interface, as a tool for stitching together diverse historical facts into a single fabric. Priestley himself considered this aspect of the timeline to be fundamental. He never presented the timeline as a passive reflection of historical facts. To him, it was always a device for doing things with data. This idea, so strong in Priestley's own writing, was not often repeated by his imitators, for whom measured linear temporal frameworks, those famous homogeneous empty frameworks of Bergson and Benjamin, had become second nature in a way that was still impossible in the 1760s. The next image I want to show speaks to that naturalization even more viscerally. This is a panel I love from XKCD. I think it's funny, but whether you like the joke or not, you know it's a joke. You know what a timeline is and what it's used for, and you know that this isn't it. Here, by the way, is a photograph from the Secret Service of what became known as the Rabbit Incident. And here, just echoing the same idea, is a wonderful ad for American Express featuring an image of the media personality and football player Tiki Barber, along with a list of the events of his life laid out against the laces of a football. Here, there are no dates, no measurements per se, but what is so striking is the assumption made by the graphic designer that the passing resemblance of the laces of the football and a timeline would render the chronographic reference obvious, and I think it is. So why return to Priestley today? Because he helps us understand the complexity of the relationship between our ideas and our visualizations. Today, we are fairly drowning in data tools, yet arguably no one has yet come up with a device to communicate information about historical relationships more effective than his. For all of the remarkable graphic innovation of our own time, we are still living within the epistemological regime that Priestley's charts at once announced and consolidated. It is a framework that demands critique, but I think it first and foremost demands historicization. While we may not yet be able to foresee an end to its importance in our culture of time, we can see back to its beginning, and doing so should sensitize us at once to its contingency and to its place in a larger visual and epistemological ecology.